Hi, this is Pastor Jeff. Just wanted to come to you for a few minutes and bend your ear for a little bit, as my parents would say, or my family would say. I want to talk to you today about hatred and how we can counter hate. It seems that hate is everywhere in the world today. There are, at this point, over 1,000 hate groups in the United States today. They're using all the modern communication technology to spread an extremely polarized view of politics and a lot of anti-other sentiments across the nation and around the world. But where does all this hatred come from? Would you be surprised if I told you that a large component of hatred is fear? Let me give you a simple example. We're going to try to keep things simple and straightforward today. When I was a kid, I hated roller coasters. Now, roller coasters had never done anything to me. No part of a roller coaster ever fell and hurt me. I wasn't injured while riding one. I just hated them. And the reason I hated them is I was afraid of heights. And you see, that first hill, I could just never get past it. That tall, spindly structure going way up in the air, and that you could see through between all those girders. That was horrifying to me. I was afraid of that. And so I hated roller coasters. Well, I went off to college at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and met a bunch of friends. And we decided one weekend that we'd head down to Kings Island in Cincinnati, Ohio, and enjoy the day at the amusement park. And of course, when you're out with your friends in college, they twist your arms into things that you didn't usually do. And for me, it was riding a roller coaster. They were astonished that I'd never been on one. So we went on this rather tame roller coaster known as the Racer, a good old machine that had been around a long time. You know the kind. Has two cars, red and blue, side by side, and they race around the course, and at the end you see who wins. And there was that first hill. And we got to the top of that hill, and I never gotten past that hill in my thinking. I was always stuck on that. So when we hit the downslope on the other side and we got to high speed, and the rest of the ride was all about the speed, I was so amazed because it turns out I loved the speed and all the turns, and you couldn't tell how high you were when you're going through all that. You were just laughing and having a great time. And I went from hating roller coasters to, once I'd become familiar with them, to loving roller coasters. And we'd go on to ride the second largest wooden roller coaster at that time, called the Beast, which was also there. And we had a great day. We have scared ourselves half to death in society these days. We are far more scared of other people than we are of roller coasters, to be sure. Now, the Bible has a lot of verses warning against fear, and as we've seen, for good reason, it leads to hatred, including the following, and I'm going to use the CEB translation because it's very short and sweet. Isaiah 41, verse 10. Don't fear, because I'm with you. Don't be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, and I will surely help you. I will hold you in my righteous strong hand. From Psalm 56, verses 3 and 4, well, the psalmist is writing back to God, and he says, whenever I'm afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. I trust in God. I won't be afraid. What can mere flesh do to me? Now, Paul wrote to the Philippians, and in chapter 4, verses 6 through 7, he advises, don't be anxious about anything. Rather, bring up all of your requests to God in your prayers and petitions, along with giving thanks. Then the peace of God that exceeds all understanding will be in your heart and mind and keep you safe in Jesus Christ. And finally, in John chapter 14, verse 27, Jesus himself promises this: peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I give to you not as the world gives. Do not be troubled or afraid. Hatred is complex. It's as complicated as anything else in our lives. But we're just going for the basics today. We're going to keep this short and sweet. Fear is behind much of our hate, starting with fear of others. We fear things and people who are different from ourselves. We feel threatened by anyone we see as different from us. We consider them an outsider and therefore unsafe. These are people we're not comfy around. These are people who don't share our own stories, our customs, and our past. So out of fear, when we see different people, rather than trying to learn who they are and become familiar with their ways, no, instead we lash out. We try to chase them away because we're scared of them. We see them as different and dangerous and a threat, even when there's absolutely no evidence that that's true, like there was none for my hatred of roller coasters. No roller coaster had ever done anything wrong to me, and yet I hated them. Goes the same with a lot of people who are different from ourselves. Then there's fear of ourselves. We hate in others what we fear in ourselves. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, that's fear for you. Others become the movie screens onto which we project what we don't like about ourselves. We project it onto them. We need to see ourselves as basically good. And so we project our own perceived badness onto somebody else, somebody who's different from ourselves, and then we attack that difference. We see badness in ourselves makes us fearful. It makes us afraid. And we've been told by others that something is bad in us or unlovable or morally reprehensible, and it creates hate and judgments towards others upon whom we paste that, our own issues, and then hate them. And it solves nothing. We're still filled with fear and with repressed badness, and this causes mental health issues somewhere down the line. It creates a lot of trouble for ourselves. We become our own worst enemies. And at that point, we no longer have any compassion for ourselves. And if we can't have compassion for ourselves, we can't have compassion for anyone else either. If we cultivate compassion in ourselves and accept our own flaws, then we can be compassionate towards others and their flaws. And we have to remember at this point that none of us is perfect. Only Jesus is perfect. Therefore, we all have flaws. Get used to it. They're everywhere. At its most destructive, when we choose not to deal with our own issues, not to work out the hard issues for ourselves in our lives, instead, in desperation, we can end up joining hate groups to distract ourselves from the works that we really ought to be doing in our own lives. And instead, we find connection with like-minded folks who have the same issue. We're attracted to hate groups and their simple answers when we feel like we're helpless and powerless and inadequate, when we're shame-filled, and when we feel we've been treated unjustly. And in this day and age right now, it's easy to feel all of those things and to be vulnerable to the attractions of hate groups. Hate makes us feel that we're under attack, and we respond in hostility and aggression towards individuals and to groups who are different from ourselves, and that's the only thing that makes them different. They're a little different in some way, therefore we see them as a threat, and we hate them. It's a terrible way to live your life. Also, we live in a fearful society. We live in a society that's steeped in violence and competition. We live in a culture today that is ready to fight. It's so afraid. And it leaves very little room for conflict resolution, for negotiations, for peace. And we've seen that. You can see that on the news each and every day. And we can see why the Bible so strongly tells us we should not be afraid, because this is what it leads to. It's a grim picture, wouldn't you say? So what do we do about it? Well, we start with educating ourselves. We start with learning that the problem exists. We educate ourselves as to where hate comes from, fear. And we become willing to address the problems in ourselves and not be distracted with hatred. And we can start the simplest place to start. With a lesson we learned at our parents' knees as very little children, we can start with the golden rule. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. Therefore, you should treat people in the same way that you want people to treat you. And how do you do that? Well, Mark chapter 12, verse 31 is a great place to start. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. We need to make sure to educate our family and our friends at home, in schools, and in community that fear leads to hatred, and to counter it, to fight against it. But what do? Well, we start, as the scriptures at the beginning started, with having faith in God. We ask God to lift the fear and the shame from us so that we can move forward free and get busy. And we start by shaking off our fear. We toss aside the fear, all the what ifs, and you think of when you think you want to take that step forward, when you don't want to be afraid and hateful. And you have those what if fears. Well, if I take this step, then maybe this or that or the other terrible thing will happen. Just remember the roller coaster ride right then. Nothing awful happened to me. It was wonderful. It was an amazing experience. I've done it many times since. So take the first step. Go and sit in that first roller coaster car and take the ride. One psychologist put it well, you start by creating cracks in the system. And you create cracks in the system by doing the simplest possible things. For instance, reconnect with one of your neighbors. Talk with a friend. Find a way to protest hatred. Go to therapy if you need to. There's no shame in it, so that you can stop hating yourself. Get to know people who are different from the people you grew up with. All those others that so many fear and hate. Learn their stories and their custom and their food. Meet their children. Share in theirs and your hopes and dreams together. And then they're not strange anymore. Then they're friends. Do that. Cultivate compassion for yourself and for others. And allow the healing to begin. Allow the fear to subside. And when you do, hate withers on the vine. In this way, we fulfill the greatest commandment of them all. Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. We do that by setting aside fear and loving our neighbors as ourselves. God bless you all. I hope you have a wonderful day. I'll talk to you later. Go fearlessly. So long.